Well, good morning, everyone. I'm delighted to be here. I'm honored to be invited to be a Hooker Distinguished Visiting Scholar. I have been to McMaster before, but it was about 7 years ago. And I really appreciate you coming out when you could be marking exams. So a lot of things have happened in the 7 years since I was last here. Some things haven't changed very much as well, but we might want to talk a little bit about that later. But I feel the ground shifting under me to some extent in terms of what's happening with technology and teaching. And for many years I thought it was just a peripheral on the side thing that wasn't really affecting everybody. But now it's quite clear that there are major changes happening in our universities. So to give you a quick overview, I want to talk about the key forces of change that's causing the ground to shift, some current trends in online and blended learning, what the implications of both the trends and the key forces of change are for how we design our courses, and then some conclusions at the end. So let's first look at the key forces of change affecting university teaching. Well, first of all, it's a changing workforce, and I'll talk a little bit more about this in more detail in a few minutes. But new work and new knowledge and skills required within the workforce. And the change in students, more diversity in the students. Need for more individualized learning as a result, more personalization of learning. New modes of delivery, blended online OERs and MOOCs, and particularly new technologies coming in. Particularly video and social media. And let's look, first of all, now you're in a better position than me to know how accurate this chart is, but what we're seeing is the knowledge-based component in many industries becoming increasingly more and more important. And it doesn't matter where your jobs are now, the knowledge component is much more important than the previous manual skills and so on. And the Conference Board of Canada many years ago, actually, I was surprised. I went back and looked at the Conference Board. I looked this up, the reference recently. It's 1995, but I don't think people quite picked it up so early as the Conference Board did. What are the skills that students need to survive in the 21st century? Well, good communication skills, independent learning skills, ethics and responsibility, teamwork and flexibility, thinking skills, of course, which universities have always taught, IT skills embedded in the subject area. Now that's an interesting one. It's not generic IT skills, knowing how to use a keyboard and so on. It's knowing how to use the technology within your subject discipline. And one example is, for instance, real estate agents knowing how to use geographical information systems, which they are now using to help them in their jobs. And the overriding skill, and the one that I would like to focus on particularly, is knowledge management. There is so much knowledge out there and it's increasing at such a rapid rate that everybody who's going to work in a knowledge-based industry needs to know how to manage knowledge on a lifelong basis. And look at the key, let me go back to that too. How many of you have read the recent report by the Royal Bank of Canada called Humans Wanted? If you haven't read it, I strongly recommend you read it. It's quite surprising. What they did is very interesting. They did a big data search on all online job advertisements in what they call future-oriented jobs. And they looked at what skills employers were looking for. And the top of the list was active listening, most important skill. The second one was speaking, ability to communicate verbally. And I could go down that list. At the bottom was programming, because basically the demand for programmers won't be so great as the demand for those other skills. Or even if a programmer has the programming skills, they need the other skills in order to succeed in the jobs. And what the Royal Bank of Canada tried to look at was what they call transversal skills, the ones that people need if their jobs disappear so they can get another job. And the question is, and what they pointed out was, first of all, employers aren't ready for this, but they also said, nor is education, because they're not teaching specifically these skills. They're hoping that students will pick them up, but they're not being explicit about the teaching of these skills. Another changing force is students, more diversity. Increasingly, students are taking multidisciplinary programs, so they come with different levels of prior knowledge in different parts of the course or program. Come from different cultures, different ways of learning, different motivations. Some people are taking a course because they're really interested in it, others because they require it to get their qualification, but they're not really interested. Different language abilities, more employed and part-time students. So the diversity of students is not like the high school leaver coming straight out of high school now at 18 and studying till they're 23 and then leaving. Students are continuing to come in, transfer and move out. There's a recent study in the US reckoned that looking at just graduate outcomes catches 67% of university students and 41% of college students because they're moving around so much between courses and programs and even different institutions. Need for recognized qualifications that are different from the traditional ones. People want recognition for short courses now. They want a badge or some indication they can take to an employer that they have a competency or skill. And the increasing importance of lifelong learning, because in the knowledge-based economy, people have to go on learning all the time, and their job base keeps changing and they have to keep learning. And that means more personalized learning. We need to provide teaching and learning in ways that allow for the diversity of students. And that means different routes and different approaches for different students. But that's a challenge because that's all right when your class sizes are small, but when they're large, that becomes very difficult. So how can you do that? Well, blended learning is one, and learning design and the use of technology is another to enable more personalization. And I'll speak about that in more detail later on. And the other key force of change are new modes of delivery. Now this is a constant. I went back to my presentation at McMaster 7 years ago, just in case, and I actually had this chart. It wasn't quite the same, but almost the same as that 7 years ago. But what's really happened is in this red area here, that's a big change over that 7 years. So at one end you have face-to-face teaching with no technology. Then you have what I've got here, classroom aids, which are PowerPoint, which is certainly better than the overhead. No, none of you are old enough to remember those. The overhead transparencies you wrote on with ink. And at the other end, we had fully online or fully distance. And at one time, those two were quite separate. But now they're getting mixed, they're getting blended. And I've got flipped classrooms. And I think most of you know what a flipped classroom is. You record your lecture, and then the students come in, watch the lecture, and come in for discussion. Or you can do it the other way around. You can give your lecture, and then the students go online and have a discussion online. But that's really, it's a little bit like the man walking in front of a steam engine with a flag so he didn't go too fast. He's just taken an old way of teaching and just putting the technology on it. What's more interesting is what I've called hybrid. And my definition of hybrid is where you actually not only reduce the amount of face time, but you do it in a deliberately designed way so as to get the best out of the face-to-face component and the best out of the online component. And you design deliberately for that, not randomly. So I've got some questions for you. Do you feel like I do that the world is changing around you? And if so, how is it affecting your teaching? Is it forcing you to do things differently? Or is it the same old? It hasn't really got to the university yet. Why don't we start with that one? How many people feel that things are changing and you need to do something about it? Quite a few. Anybody feel it isn't really? It's just a load of BS and now it's time to say it. Because the door's over there. Okay. Okay, does a greater focus on skills and learning outcomes undermine or reinforce the academic endeavour? I mean, I often get the comment that, well, our job is not to train people for the workforce, it's to make them better individuals, and I agree with that, actually. But is a focus on skills rather than on content and focus on what students can actually do when they graduate, does that undermine the academic enterprise? And what are your feelings about that? Is this a win-win, or is it something that you actually lose if you move in this direction? You're very shy. I bet you're not like that in your own classes. Yes, please.
No, I don't think it does. I mean, this is what medical schools, engineering schools have been doing forever, is the skills as well as the theoretical underpinnings. As long as you keep those two things tied together,
Right.
I think it's fine. Because otherwise, students don't stay here forever, so they
Okay.
have to go out and they have to be able to do.
Right. Is the diversity of students a challenge for your teaching? Do you find you've got very mixed classes in terms of abilities, in terms of motivation and so on? I see some nodding heads. Yeah. So I'm not wrong in thinking that we're no longer getting that very straightforward, heterogeneous group of students coming through and moving out. Yes, please.
I was going to say the diversity of students, for me, facilitates teaching, because we are talking about knowledge workers. So when you have a diverse, heterogeneous class, you have different points of view, different opinions. That stimulates learning. That makes my job much easier.
Yeah,
I
right.
find it much more difficult to teach a homogeneous class.
Right, good point, yeah. I thought I saw somebody else wanted to say something. No? Okay. Yes, please.
So, in our own programs, I think the MBA program and the diversity is not only in terms of gender and race and so on, but also in terms of educational background. They come from all walks of different
Yeah.
things. So, and that's quite valuable.
Yeah. Okay, good. Yes. Well, I'm glad people see that as a positive, because I've often heard it as a negative from faculty saying that students aren't like what they used to be and they're not as motivated, etc., etc. And I think we're getting a mix. We are getting some students who are not motivated, but we're also getting highly motivated students, and that's a problem when they're in the same class. And I've got this, I like this diagram, you know, it's called the VUCA future. It's volatile, uncertain, complex and ambiguous, and what you need to do is to leave the shore of certainty and move across the sea of complexity, ambiguity and so on to the future state. And this is what we're really talking about. How do we move from where we are to manage we don't actually know what the future is going to be, but we know it's going to be different. So what are the trends then? Well, first of all, fully online learning, that's distance education, is increasing rapidly on conventional universities. That's a graph from the US, which ends at 2012. And last year, I led a research team that did a survey of online learning in Canada, in universities and colleges, two-year colleges. It was the first fully national survey. We covered all 203 public universities and colleges in Canada. Got about 70% of the institutions responding, and they covered about 78% of all student enrollment. So for a voluntary survey, it was a pretty good response rate. And I guess the most surprising thing was how many universities are actually doing fully online credit-based learning. This is not continuing studies, this is courses for credit within their programs. So 98% of Canadian universities and 94% of colleges outside Quebec offer fully online courses. The reason the figures are lower in Quebec is that they have something called Cégep à distance, which is the online provider for all the colleges. But at the same time, a lot of the colleges are getting into their own online learning as well as leaving it to Cégep à distance. And what was particularly interesting was the growth. Enrollments have gone up about 10% per year in online learning in universities and 15% in the colleges. And Ontario is a big factor here because of eCampus Ontario. It got a lot of colleges moving into online learning and catching up. Our best estimate, because we didn't have a census, only a survey, but our best estimate is that of all the enrollments in universities, 16% are now fully online. So, and about 12% in colleges. And you can see the growth rate is quite rapid, and we don't see any signs of that declining. And incidentally, the completion rates from the data that was available is pretty good. They're about 5% to 10% below the on-campus completion rates, and that's what I would expect because many of these students are working and part-time and they're doing studies on top of other stuff. So, and the second trend we picked up was what I call hybrid learning, and we defined this very carefully in the survey as some reduction in face-to-face teaching. And again, a surprise for us was how many institutions reported they offered at least some hybrid learning, but few courses. So it's wide and thin. 60% with less than 10% of the courses were hybrid. But most provosts felt that this was going to increase the number of hybrid programs. They felt that faculty were moving into this area, and they felt that it was leading to a lot of innovative teaching. It was making faculty think much more carefully about their teaching methods and how best to do this. And also some reported it was, especially the institutions that were overcrowded and needed more facilities, that it was helping with the space issues in teaching. So in the last 2 years, there's been a fairly big move to learning in Canada, and looking at some of the plans that institutions have, I wouldn't be surprised if 50% of all classes will be hybrid by 2020 in 2 years' time, at the rate of growth we're going. A lot of it's flipped teaching, but it can be so much more. And it raises a very interesting question. What is the best use of face-to-face time? What is the right mix? Now, at one time, everybody thought the default was face-to-face teaching must be superior to online teaching. But we have so much experience now to show that online teaching is often as good as, or if not better, than face-to-face teaching. And like everything, it depends on how well you do it. You can do face-to-face teaching badly, or you can do online learning badly. So it's not a question so much of the delivery mode, it's a question of the quality of the design of the teaching in whichever mode you're working. But we don't have very good theory or tools to make a decision about what is best done online. We have to draw on your experience, the experience as a professor, and obviously your biases, because if you've taught on face-to-face all your life, you're going to have more biases to thinking that's going to be better. But I think if you are offering a blended course, it's a really good question to ask, what is the added value of students getting on a bus in the morning and coming into the campus if they can do most of their stuff at home online? And that, I think the challenge isn't, we know how to design online very well, but what we don't know is what is it that added value to face-to-face. And the answer will be different from subject to subject, from instructor to instructor. But we don't have very good theory to help instructors make that decision. We're relying on your gut instincts and so on. The other thing that we asked institutions was, how important did they think online learning would be for their future? And over 2/3 of all the institutions in Canada, and more or less the same in colleges and universities, estimated that online learning will be very important for their future. And most have or are developing a strategy or plan for online learning. Now, it doesn't mean that necessarily they've got a good plan, or that the plan's been implemented, or that the plan goes right across the university, but they do have a plan, which is great, because a few years ago the answer to that would have been much less. Another trend, of course, is MOOCs. driven primarily by Stanford, Harvard, and MIT. And I want to say a comment about that. Stanford, Harvard, and MIT were very late coming to online learning. Online learning had been around for about 15 years, and as you see, it's been fairly extensively used in many other universities. So they had to reinvent online learning in their own brand. This is what they're very good at, these elite universities, is reinventing stuff in their own brand. And MOOCs, incidentally, the term MOOC is a Canadian term, came from the University of Manitoba, but it was hijacked particularly by Stanford originally. And so it's another kind of online learning. And I want to make that distinction very clearly. It is not the same as fully online learning for credit courses. So it's a different design model from credit-based online learning, and it's very heavily lecture-focused. And attempts at there have been attempts at accreditation, but it's a massive challenge when you've got very, very large numbers of students to have an effective, valid assessment of very large numbers of students and virtually very few instructors. But it is very useful for non-credit continuing education. There's a lot of demand for it, as you can see, that people want these kind of programs, and they're great, but they're not going to give you, not going to make you a qualified engineer or a qualified doctor and so on. But it can add to your lifelong learning in a very constructive way. And we found, in the survey, we found no MOOC mania in Canada. Less than 20% of institutions are offering MOOCs, and very few of them saw it as critical to their future. But another trend, which is more under the radar, but I think is much more significant than MOOCs, is the open education movement. Open textbooks, open research, publications now for any federal grant have to be published in an open access journal. There's all kinds of games being played by the publishers to make people pay to get them published, but at least they're openly accessible to people who want to read them. Open educational resources, and the important about an open data too. Increasingly government are making data more open, not Facebook but other agencies. And the key thing here is that content will be free, abundant, and nearly all online. And that's a big shift, because this is no longer the kind of monopoly of universities. It's now everywhere. Even university knowledge is now everywhere. And MOOCs are a good example of that. My grandson has just started doing physics at a British university. And I came home one day and I said, he was on his computer and he usually plays games. I said, what are you doing? He said, I'm doing my homework. I said, what do you mean your homework? He says, well, I'm doing physics. I said, yes, but what are you doing online? And he said, well, I've got a textbook and all the exercises are online. I just go online and I practice till I get them right. I said, does your professor know you're doing this? He says, no. And I said, do you go to his lectures? He said, well, we have a group of 5 of us and we go to 1 in 5 lectures. And I said, what do you mean? You go to 1 in 5? He says, well, we take a note of what the topics are and then we circulate that. Then we go to Open Courseware, MIT Open Courseware, and look up the lectures because they're much better there. Now, you know, we can argue about whether he's doing the right thing or not, but that's my point. That stuff is all out there now, and if you're not a really good lecturer, then students are going to go elsewhere and get that. Now, in fact, we could actually make use of that. What I'm saying is that this shifts the role of the faculty member from content selector, organizer, and deliverer to a facilitator. It's the students now who ought to be going out and finding the information, evaluating it, and applying it. What we do in a lecture is exactly that, but we do it for the students. In a knowledge-based society, the students are going to have to do that for themselves. Now, we can model it as lectures, and that's a very good way of doing it, But do we follow up on that and say to the students, okay, now you go off and do it. Here's a topic, you research it. You come back with that and tell us what it is. So I think this is the big game changer. The fact that content is open and freely available, and you can use it as well. You don't have to deliver the stuff. You can tell the students, go and look at the MIT lecture on this. It's better than anything I could do, but what I want you to do is to criticize it and come back here and discuss it with me, all right? So it does change the role of the faculty member. And open publishing, free online open textbooks. I'm fortunate to be in British Columbia, where we have the BC Campus Open Textbook. They now have 165 books. They've covered all the first and second year university and college standard programs. They all have open textbooks now, written or approved by BC faculty for their courses. And they've been adopted by 21 of the 25 post-secondary institutions in British Columbia. And it saves students over $2 million so far in textbook fees. And my book, which you've got on your desk there, it's been downloaded over 100,000 times now, and actually translated into 8 languages with 2 underway, but one's in Iranian, one in Farsi, and one in Turkish, and I'm having a bit of problems getting those finished. And these are all done by volunteers. No publisher involved here. People have said, well, we need this book, we'll translate it. It's a good way for us to learn as well. Now, it doesn't mean it's not like 100,000 book sales. It could be one demented person in California who's downloaded all 100,000. But, you know, it depends what you want. Do you need to get a book published to get tenure and promotion, or do you want to get your ideas out to everybody? And if you want to get your ideas out to as many people as possible, then open publishing is the way to go. If you want to get tenure, that's another matter. And the last trend is multimedia. Now, print and talk have historically been dominant in higher education, and print particularly is very important because it allows you to take abstract ideas, present them in a linear, logical sequence, and you can make it open to challenge and discussion. So print is a very important medium and is still a very important medium. But knowledge now can be represented through many different kinds of media, through text, audio, video, computing, and virtual reality. And I've got a graph here showing the continuum medium of media richness. Single media like radio or a telephone, you can only listen, to very rich media like virtual reality, which has all those modalities and so on. And the research in this is very interesting. There's a lot of research on learning from media. And the research shows that learning is usually enhanced by multiple representations of knowledge. In other words, if you talk about something, you show them a video, and you ask them to do something, they learn much more than if you just talk. And one of the most significant pieces of research is on the importance of recording, because students can stop, start, and repeat. So if you're giving a video lecture, for instance, the student will spend much more time on the video lecture than if they come into class. It just goes through and they get their notes and they go. So it allows learners to work at their own pace, and this use of media is really important for facilitating learning. And it allows students to move from the concrete to the abstract in reverse. Video is very good at that. Usually the soundtrack is the abstraction, the explanation, and the video is what's actually happening. And this is really great for case studies, for instance. You want to pull out some general principles about how to run a meeting, for instance. You can have the meeting and you can have the soundtrack which explains what's going on and so on. And presenting in different media meets individual preferences for learning. So it's another way of personalizing the teaching. By offering a variety of media to the students, you meet a different way. Some people like to listen. I have a hearing problem, I'd rather read. And so having different media enables you to accommodate the student differences. So I have some questions for you now. Here's your homework. Do you see these trends as significant or just passing fancies or BS? Have you adopted any of these trends in your teaching? And if so, how? And what teaching issues could one or more of these trends address for you? Anybody want to make some comments on those questions? How about the first one? Do you think these are significant trends, or is it just some TEDx guy coming and trying to sell you a pitch on this? Yes, please.
I think it's significant because everyone is using technology in every part of their lives, and we have to adapt as well.
Yeah.
It's very significant.
Yeah, so I think the important thing for me is that in the digital world, if we want students to be competent in that digital world, if you want to earn digitally, you're going to have to learn digitally. I think that's really important because you can't learn in some kind of abstract way and then go to another kind of context and hope you can just easily transfer that over to that context. So yes, I'm not saying it's a good thing that everybody is in a digital world, but nevertheless we are now, and therefore how can we teach a subject if it's not embedded within the teaching? Yes, please.
Just I wonder, like, some of this is driven by cost considerations. I know some had, right?
Sorry.
Some of it's probably driven by cost considerations. I know, or by the way people are living and how they access education, because it could reduce costs of delivering education through these online kind of or blended mediums. Yeah. But to what extent do you think, and where, is it better outcomes versus reduced cost outcomes? Is that a fair question to ask?
Yeah, I think it's a very fair question. And the evidence is it's a scaling issue. How much can you scale up? And there are some parts of online learning you can scale, like the content delivery, you can scale that up. What you can't scale is the interaction, the assessment, and you can scale that to a certain extent if you can do multiple choice questions, if you want the students just to check that they've covered everything, but it doesn't get to the higher learning skills of critical thinking and so on. You're into essays and then it gets, or into doing other ways or project work or something, and then it gets very difficult to scale up in terms, you still need instructors to do that. That's a good thing, by the way. I think we will go on needing faculty for quite some time. Yes?
There's one good example in McMaster where teaching issues are addressed by technology, and it's in our Masters of Health program where individuals that are busy professionals that couldn't normally come into class very frequently or live in remote areas, Canada's a big place, they can get their education online. It provides them huge value.
Yeah.
I mean, if these technologies didn't exist, they would never have gotten this education. So in that case,
Yeah.
it's reaching a completely new demographic and not necessarily transforming where we teach undergraduate students, per se.
Yeah, access is a critical issue for many students, particularly when they're working or if they've got young families to look after. The cost of childcare, for instance, is ideal for people who are in that context. So there's two issues here. One is the student needs, and I think the case is overwhelming about the flexibility and value of online learning for access. The other are what I call the teaching needs, which are how do I teach my subject given the context in which I'm working. And there I think it's less clear-cut what the advantages are, but there are advantages, and what we're in fairly much the early stages of identifying what are the advantages and disadvantages of going online from a teaching and a learning in the sense of this is the subject I'm trying to teach and what are the requirements of that subject. And it's not something, I think the important thing is not to think of a subject as something solid and I've got this subject over here, therefore I've got to teach it online. And I will teach this subject without changing this subject area when I go online. There may be things you can do better online that you can't do in class. There may be things that students can go off and do in an online context that they can't in an on-campus context. And you may want to go back and look at your curriculum and say, well, maybe I should be doing something different here because this would be more useful for the students in the long run. So it's a question of attitude as well. Okay, I like this. Implications for teaching and learning. We could have empty lecture theatres. Okay, let's go back to this continuum of technology use. And I think for every instructor now, you've got a question here. Where should I be on that continuum with my course? Now, I could say well, maybe it's not a question for you, it's a question for the students. Where do the students want to be on this? And could you design a course that would allow students to come in at any one of these points? So if they were high school students, not very independent in their learning skills, they could do everything face-to-face, but you could gradually perhaps introduce some online learning as part of a fully face-to-face course to get them used to being responsible for getting stuff done on time, bringing it back into class and so on. By the time they get to the 4th year of their undergraduate program, they could probably handle 3 or 4 courses fully online because your program has worked you up towards that. So the questions, where on the curriculum should I be? I think the mode of delivery should be driven primarily by the needs of the students. So in your, I always get this bacon, lettuce and tomato MBA. Yeah, thank you. You've got 25 to 35-year-old people with work experience, right? They're going to be much more tolerant of fully online than your 18-year-old coming out of high school who wants the campus, who wants to meet other boys and girls, wants the social atmosphere, wants the sports and so on. So I think it should be as much driven by the needs of the students as by the subject matter. Although obviously some things are harder to teach online than others. But if we accept that lifelong learning is going to become increasingly important, then from a purely market point of view, you've really got to start looking at that market, because if you look at the demographics, the number of students coming in from 18 are going to go down and the number of lifelong learners are going to go up. So you need to have programs that are going to accommodate those lifelong learners, and that's going to be as important, if not more important, than dealing with the high school leaver. The second is this distinction I make, which is a bit artificial, I accept that, between content and skills. Let me give some definition here. Content are facts, ideas, principles. It's basically knowing stuff. Skills are about understanding, analyzing, evaluating, applying, doing stuff. And it's not that simple because you can't do stuff unless you know stuff. But the emphasis, both are necessary, but the emphasis in post-secondary education all over the world has been on content, delivering content to students. And as I said earlier, that's going to become less important because they can access the content. But they do need help developing skills. They can't do that on their own so easily. We know a lot about how to teach skills. First of all, it's content specific to some extent. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, let's take problem solving as a skill. Problem solving in medicine is different from problem solving in business. Not only is the content base different, but the approach to problem solving is different. For instance, in medicine, they are very risk averse. So problem solving is all about avoiding risk. In business, it's different. There's a much higher tolerance for risk in problem solving. So it's not just you become a problem solver and you can go anywhere and solve problems. You have to solve problems within a certain context, and there are ways of doing that. Now, mind you, if you did learn how to solve problems in medicine, it might be a lot easier to move into business and transfer that knowledge more quickly than if you'd never done a problem-solving course at all. But it wouldn't be the same. You'd still have to learn something different. The second thing we know is that learners need a lot of practice to develop a skill. And this is where the technology comes in. How do you give students practice in, say, problem solving or critical thinking? You give them lots of examples to work through. And you can do that through the technology. They can work through those examples. You can't always give them the right answer, but you can give them some guidelines and they can share the answers, for instance, among each other and so on. So they can get some feedback from students as well as from you. They need small steps. They need regular feedback from an expert, so that's where the instructor and the knowledge, where the content specialist comes in. They need that feedback from an expert. But I don't know how many of you have heard of competency-based learning? Yeah, big thing in America at the moment. Employers negotiate with a program the competencies they need within a particular industry. Now, what I'm talking about is different from competencies. Competencies, you get to 100% performance, so you can do a specific job, and that's done, right? And there's nothing wrong with that, and it's very good for the short-term market. Skills are very different. Skills, I just like to think of a hockey player. A hockey player isn't concerned to just be competent. They want to get better and better and better. And they want to go on learning how to do that. So they want to go on practicing and practicing. Or a golfing analogy. Lee Trevino was once, he chipped in from off the green 4 times in one round. And the instructor said, the interviewer said to him, "Well, Lee, you were a bit lucky with your chips today, weren't you?" And Trevino said, "Yeah, but it's funny, isn't it? The more I practice, the luckier I get, you know?" So you need lots of practice, small steps, regular feedback. But the important thing for teaching is, if we're talking about critical thinking skills, it's not something you teach in one course. So how do you hand on from one course to the next? What do you develop in one course, and when they're going in the second year, what's going to be different in what you do in critical thinking? So what is the link through a program? Now, I came across a very interesting development at Dalhousie. They had a Bachelor of Computer Science, and only 2/3 of the students were graduating. For 2/3 of the entry cohort were actually going out with a degree. So they had a big problem. So what they did, they looked at what were the learning outcomes of each professor. Their program was, at that stage, developed like most university programs. They found how many professors were willing to teach in the program, and they cobbled together the interests of all the different professors. And some said, "I like to teach first-year students," some said, "I like to teach third-year students." So there was no cohesion in the program at all. So they got the professors to write down their learning outcomes. And then they worked out which ones had to be taught first before they went on to the next course. And what they found was they were teaching theory at the end of the program, and students needed theory right at the beginning, because without the theory, they couldn't handle all the other developments that came. So what they've got now is a very nice little tool which says, first year students, here are the learning outcomes, and here are the courses that you need these learning outcomes for. And if you're in a third year, here are all the learning outcomes and the courses that you need to get into this course, and so on. And the students can go in and just click on the course, and they can find out exactly what they need to know. And now guess what? They've got 95% completion rates. Now, you can't always do that in something like business, I know, because it's not that kind of sequential linear. But there's a lot of things you need to know before you move on to something else. And if we're talking about skills particularly, how are we going to make sure that continuity of skills runs through a program? So, and developing skills is about teaching method. It's about method, about design. So there are various ways to teach skills. And I won't go through the whole list, but obviously experiential learning is one way, and this is where McMaster is very strong, I know. But there are other ways to teach skills as well. So when you're deciding on a curriculum, before you even think about blended learning or online, what are the skills we want to teach, and how will the technology help us develop those skills? What role can technology play in helping you develop those skills? And the other thing is, what do we assess and how? So if we're teaching skills, how do we assess those skills? Now, I think there's a lot of, I think students do learn critical thinking, but if they do, it's almost accidental. They pick it up by chance and some kind of osmosis. Now, I don't want to go to the other behaviorist route where you have to write down everything you do, but we need to define skills a lot better. We need to say how we can assess those skills a lot better, and then we need to look at the teaching methods that will get us there. And then we need to look at how technology can help. So that's the kind of order of decision. So what are the teaching methods for skills development? Well, discussion and social learning for testing and developing ideas, problem-based learning, experiential learning, getting students to do stuff, communities of practice, putting students not just in their own community, but in the broader community. So, for instance, if they're studying real estate, bring in real estate agents and so on, and put them online into real estate agent discussion groups, forums and so on. I hate to say it, maybe even put them into a Facebook group. Competency-based learning and knowledge management. So there are different skills that you can teach. I want to say something particularly about knowledge management. We need to move from information transmission to knowledge management, combining skills development and content. And that means to me replacing a lot of lecture-based courses with student projects, problem-based learning, collaborative learning. Get the students to go out and find the information. You advise them where to look, what kind of information is relevant and so on. You get them to think critically about what they're finding, but they do the work. And this again, somebody says, isn't online teaching more work? Well, it can be, but the trick is to get the students to do the work. And goodbye written exams. Now, in business particularly, I think there's a huge role for e-portfolios. E-portfolios aren't magic. It's basically a student reports or videos or writes up their experience in experiential learning, for instance, so you can see what they've done. They actually show what they've done. It's like a diary, if you like, but it's online. And you can have it in a format where the students can take it to an employer and say, not only did I get a degree, but this is what I did. Now, that might be a bit scary for some of you, but nevertheless, I think it's a good thing. I don't think it'll get the student the interview, but when they get to the interview, it might help the difference between the other people on the interview if they've got a good e-portfolio, where employers can see what they've actually done, but it's also useful for the students. Because if we're talking about lifelong learning, they need to be able to build up that e-portfolio, not just on a degree, but for the rest of their life. So they can continually refresh that e-learning portfolio. And it's a lot more fun looking at a student's e-portfolio than marking essays, believe me. I want to give one example of a focus in business on teaching a specific skill. These are collaboration skills. Now, Tom Brown's a professor at the SFU School of Business. I don't know what GDBA stands for. You probably know better than I do. It's a fully online course, a program. And his complaint was that students in business don't like collaborating. They're very competitive. And it's not a skill that many of his students, he felt, were very good at, was collaborating. So he put them into virtual teams with a project to do. And they were assessed both on the project and on how much and how well they collaborated in the team. And he did the assessment of that. The students did not do the assessment of that. But I think it was 5%, I can't see the figure from here, I think 5 or 7% of the mark was given by the students of how much the other students contributed to the class. And again, he found that their collaborative skills increased rapidly as a result of doing that. This is fully online, incidentally. It wasn't done in class. So, what would an advanced online blended course look like? Well, for instance, we could take a core skill like knowledge management, how to find, analyze, evaluate, and apply information, using open content, students going out and finding it, or you are supplying the open content, but within a learning design. There are learning outcomes, there are things the students have to do, there's a schedule and timeline for them doing that. Student generate multimedia content through online project work, they're assessed by e-portfolios. And I'll give you an example from UBC. Interestingly, this is a course designed by David Porter, who's now the director of eCampus Ontario, but was at that time in BC, and an entrepreneur called David Voigt, who runs his own software company in Vancouver. And this is an education course. It's how to set up a business based on, an education business based on technology. And the course is different every year. So the students come and they choose, they go out and research technologies under development, mainly apps under development. And they may not be for education, but then they have to come back with a business plan, and they end up by doing a 2.5-minute elevator pitch, which they share, and then once it's been peer reviewed, it goes up on YouTube for everybody to see, and they get us 20% of their assessment for that. And the instructors don't know year from year what the content's going to be, except they have to have there's a module on developing a business plan and things like that, but generally the students do the research. So one year it was all on mobile learning, the next year it could be on virtual reality. But it's the students who find the topics, and then the faculty have to be nimble and react. And these courses, apart from the general preparation of knowing they have to do a business plan, what the outcomes have to be and so on, there's very little advanced planning. The professors have to work on their feet. So this is a very different design model from a lot of online courses where everything's done up front before the course is delivered. The professor walks away and adjuncts teach it. This is a very different model indeed. But we need a lot more new designs. The other thing is, I noticed in your report for the e-learning strategy, you know, this is new, there are new developments, we have to be flexible. I absolutely agree with that. But we do have past experience in this field. We have over 20 years of research and evaluation on fully online learning. So in fully online, we know what works and what doesn't. We have good design models for fully online. And what we know is you just can't move lecture content online and without adaptation and so on. It has to be made more interactive. The students have to have activities. They have to have clear timelines for doing work and so on. But in a blended model, we don't have good models, but we need to ask that question, what's best done on campus and what's best done online? The other thing is that teaching performance, I think, will become a major competitive advantage in the future. Not at the moment. Institutions are ranked by their research. The world rankings take almost no account of teaching. It's an absolute disgrace what's happened with the world rankings. I don't know why universities allow the ranking agencies to get away with this, because good teaching institutions suffer very badly as a result of these rankings. And what it does, it forces faculty further and further away to spending time on teaching rather than research. But I think that will change because of students, and students will start saying, look, I can get the content anywhere. What I need is this university is really good at helping students succeed and graduate. And I think that will become a competitive advantage, but it's not at the moment. And obviously instructors need more pedagogical knowledge and technology skills. You're trained for research, not for teaching. PhD is a good training in research, not a good training in teaching. That requires both pre-service and in-service training, and also a tenure and promotion system that rewards good teaching at the same level as good research. So it's no good having 10 tenured teaching professorships and 2,000 research tenured professorships. You've got to have 50-50 if it's going to have any impact. And you need a lot of learning technology support and working in teams. So in conclusion, the digital economy requires high-level intellectual skills. Teaching methods should include opportunities for skills development. Technology enables more flexible delivery and more ways to practice skills, but it needs to be within a specifically designed learning environment that supports the learners. So, question time. Any questions, but I put 3 up for you, which you can read.
I appreciate your point about recognizing the importance of teaching, tenure, promotion, for whatever. How do we assess good teaching? How do we know whether good teaching has taken place?
Well, that's the danger of online learning, because you've actually got a record of the teaching as well. So you can see what the teacher has done, and you can see how they interacted with students, for instance, in the online discussion forums. It's much more transparent, online learning, than face-to-face classes. It's there. Somebody can go and look at it if they want to. Now, I don't think that's the right way to do it.
You can look at what's taking place, but you don't know that learning is taking place.
No,
There's only
no, and
teaching. So great performance might be
That's right,
terrible teaching.
that's right.
We don't know.
But I think it has to be based on student performance, but that's difficult because you have to know what students could do before they came in as well as what they can do when they go out. So you have to take that into account. So yes.
And we also need to know what they do when they go out into the
Yeah.
world and try and implement it.
And I think I really hate the standard student evaluation forms that are sent out. They're absolutely meaningless in terms of what students have actually learned. And often the most uncomfortable classes, the ones they dislike the most, the ones where they learn the most. So
Exactly. So do you have any good recommendations for how we can improve
well,
assessment?
I do think that if you can
learning?
specify the outcomes and particularly what skills students are learned, and you can evaluate their level of skill performance, then I think, and it's certainly if you have a program, you can see what their skill level is when they come in, and you can see the added value of each professor as they go through the program. So I think there are ways to do it, but it's difficult. They've tried it in Britain. They had a very good way of evaluating research. They tried to apply the same process to evaluating teaching, and it collapsed within 3 or 4 years because there are so many factors other than the instructor that affect learning outcomes. And so if you're looking at a multivariable analysis, I hate to say it, but professors have about a 6 or 7% influence on what students learn. I mean, the students, their parents have more influence probably in terms of what they prepare the kids to do when they get to university than you'll have in one semester with a group of students. So I think it is a very difficult question. But I think, as I said, online learning is more transparent, and you can tell whether, for instance, professors are interacting with students and what the level of interaction is. Now, again, this is where you'll hear a lot about learning analytics and data-driven analysis. But unfortunately, the level of learning analytics at the moment is counting the number of clicks that a student has on the learning management system, which is, again, useless. You've got to have much more sophisticated measures. I'm not saying learning analytics couldn't be valuable, but until we find ways of measuring qualitative interactions, then it's going to be very difficult. But there are ways of doing it. I think it's too much of an excuse to say it can't be done. We need to put more effort into it. But nevertheless, I recognise the difficulties of doing it. Yes, please.
For your advice on best practices for implementing the synchronous part of an online course versus the asynchronous part. Because we can be lazy and just move PDF files and PowerPoint onto an online platform and have the students read and consume that information whenever they want.
Right.
If we want to incorporate the actual live classroom experience or a quasi version of the live classroom experience through an online platform, what places are doing that really well? Because I find that's a very difficult process to replicate online.
Okay, there are 2 or 3 things here. The first one is, what are you trying to get from the synchronous experience that they wouldn't get from an asynchronous one? Okay, so you.
Yep. If I can answer that question, the asynchronous one is really, like you said in your slide earlier, just the absorption of certain technical content, right? That they can do at their own pace, at their own time, given a certain window. The synchronous part is really the interaction with the professor for Q&A and with themselves from a collaborative perspective.
Well, they can do that online too.
Yes, they can, but I find that the quality of collaboration when they're chatting in a chat window is nowhere near.
But you then have to set up the discussion forum in a more structured manner than that. So you use a discussion forum, you set topics for discussion, you require every student to participate, etc., and you go in at a regular period to supervise what they're doing and give feedback. So again, it's a question of how well you do it. If you can do a good you can do a good synchronous one and a bad asynchronous one, but you can also do the opposite.
Yeah, I get that. Yeah.
Right. So the question comes then: what is the added value of students being together in real time with a professor? What is that added value that you can give? If you can answer that, well, you don't need me to tell you. Okay.
I think in very
very complex iterative discussions. So what's an example of a complex iterative discussion? How does a current event, say something happens in the news today, that morning, how does that map onto a case discussion that we had that week, given the framework or the concept or the theory we were trying to teach that week? So it's a very complex discussion that's hard to replicate.
Don't misunderstand me. I'm not saying you shouldn't do that.
Yeah.
Right? But you want to do it synchronously to
Yes.
students at a
I'd
distance.
like a portion of that online.
You see, I wouldn't try to do that. What I would do is if you want students who are dispersed to communicate, I would do online, then I would do that through a discussion forum.
Yeah.
But if you wanted them to interact with you in a live situation, to bring them on campus to do that.
I've got that part covered.
Okay.
So there's 3 pieces that I need covered, and I'm struggling to get the 3rd piece.
Yeah, well, I'm not very fond of recorded. Well, what happens is a lot of the students won't attend.
Yes, because you archive them.
And
So if
they'll
I
archive them, and then you don't get
never
the
come.
interaction.
They never show up. I'm struggling
That's
with
right.
that
So
too.
that's
I would prefer not to
well,
archive
well,
them.
don't do it then.
Force them to be there online at that time.
Well, don't do it. Don't do it. If you can't see any added value in doing it, don't
Yeah.
do it.
Okay.
I mean, everything you do, you have to say, what is it that's better doing it this way than doing it that way?
Yeah.
And there's a different answer for every context and situation, and depending on your experience as well. I mean, if you're I mean, some professors don't like discussion, but when they go online, they can have this discussion because it's asynchronous. They can see what the students are doing, and they can intervene at the right moment. Whereas in class, they don't like that. They're nervous about that.
Yeah.
And other professors get a real buzz from doing that with students in front of them and don't want to do it online, and that's fine. It's what motivates the student that matters, not some kind of theory about online is worse or better than face-to-face. I don't think I've made sense here, but yes, please.
Thanks a lot, Tony. A couple of sort of stepping back a bit on what you've been discussing this morning. You're talking about change. You're talking about strategic ways in which some universities are now recognizing that this is the way to go, and your data supports that. But if we're still at the strategy level and we're talking about change, I was reminded by, of course, Peter Drucker's quote about culture eating strategy for breakfast and maybe also for lunch. And so I guess my comment and question is about culture. So great question raised about assessment, for example. And just because we are unable to assess teaching as well as we say assess research, doesn't mean that it can't be done. Because other places are doing it, and they're doing it quite well. They're using peer assessment for teaching, and they've got great models that are working. But when they are not working in a particular institution, it seems like more of a cultural question of certain traditions and behaviors that faculty are engaged in, or perhaps the research intensity means for a university like McMaster, you have to give up something in order to make those changes that you're sort of suggesting. So what should faculty be giving up to invest a considerable amount of time and development that would be required for the kind of change you're asking?
Well, I'd say 2 things. I think you're absolutely right. The cultural change must come first. There must be a will and desire to change. If there isn't, it's not going to happen. And that has to come in the end. This is why I'm here. Try to get you. And I'm sure if you're already here, you already have that will to change. So it's the ones who are not here I should be talking to. But basically, yes, you've got to have, because you can't impose it from the top down. It's got to come in a university. It's got to come from the faculty. So they have to believe that it's important to do. Now, there's 2 things. There's believing it's important to do, and there's being rewarded for doing it. And they're not necessarily always in sync. So again, how do you reward? Now, one way is to have a fund to buy professors out to redesign courses. So they're clear they're teaching for 1 semester, but they can design a blended or fully online course, working with instructional designers in that time. So I have.
Do you think that has actually had a significant impact?
Oh,
and
absolutely.
change with
If I look at
applying
UBC,
professors?
yeah, if I look at UBC, that's how the whole system worked for getting online going. A lot of faculty got their time board. Now, that gets, if you look at Rogers' curve of innovation, that gets the early adopters. And if you're lucky, you get professors who have a lot of influence in the department doing it. And then you get the followers who will come on. You can't go on doing that forever, giving money. But eventually it becomes a way of doing things, and it becomes accepted. But you have to get over that gap from the early adopters into the main body of the faculty. And a little bit of money helps, definitely.
What about your comment of students? You were talking a lot about, you know, content being acquired by students, and they can do that. They can access that content, and our job is more about interpreting and discussing and raising the bar for the learning to occur.
Well, I think it's also about setting standards too, about what counts as academically reliable information and what counts as reasonable argument and so on. So it's about setting standards as well as monitoring and saying, no, that's not good enough. This is what you have to do to get up to the next level. Yes, please.
In your experience at UBC, other institutions, or preferably if there's any empirical evidence on this, when a change is occurring at an institution, does it come from tenured faculty, non-tenured faculty?
Good
Because we
question.
have tenured track, PhD students, and how does one protect faculty whose incentives might be misaligned with engaging in these kind of activities?
Yeah. Okay. This is very qualitative and personal. Okay, so I'd like to see a lot more research being done about changing universities than there has been, but I found often that it was the more senior professor who'd already made their career, who were a little bored with their teaching, who were often the most innovative in going online, because they had a deep understanding of their subject. They realized it could be taught in different ways. And I'll give you one example. We had a professor of forest ecology, and he taught a first year class of 200. So he had 10 groups of 20 that he took out into the forest nearby. It took an hour and a half to get them all organized, get them out, do the walk through the forest, explain what plants were growing where they were, and come back. And he did that 10 times. And he said, you know, this is killing me. You know, this is not a... So we did a virtual walk through the forest. So students could scan with their mouse different parts of the forest. It was a sort of 360-degree panoramic. And when they clicked on a point, a question would come up: why is this plant here? And then see this, little notes where they could go and find the answers, and so on. So, and that was a professor who was very secure in his tenure. He knew what he was doing, but he had all the work was actually done by 2 PhD students who then eventually became professors and then went on to teach using technology in very good ways, because they worked with a professor that had a lot of respect for, and that carried over. So it's change management, it's classic change management. Now, it doesn't always work like that, but it happened quite often to me at UBC, because that professor had nothing to lose by doing something different. In fact, he had something to gain. Now, if you take somebody trying to get tenure and they've got to get their research papers published, and you say, well, you've got to find another 12 hours a week to do this, it's not going to happen, no matter how keen and enthusiastic they are. Yeah.
Just interested in rubrics or grading of online discussions, because like I've been wanting to think about moving some of my participation that I have in class in a classroom setting to an online version, or finding some mix there. But I struggle with how do I grade discussion. Do you have any advice on that?
Yeah, grading discussions is interesting. I always tell students that purpose of this discussion is to enable you to do better assignments, right? Now, I would ask them to, I've tried various things. I've graded students, say very small grade, but it can make a difference between a B plus and a B, you know, about participation. If they don't participate, they lose a grade or lose a couple of grades, you know.
Kind of like a binary.
But you know, to be honest, I have learning outcomes, and I don't really care how the student gets to those learning outcomes. So if some students prefer to sit and read a lot rather than go into the online discussions and can perform well at the learning outcome level, that's fine. Other students need that discussion because they haven't really got a grasp of the topic. They need help, they need to try their ideas out, and that works for them, that's fine. So I'm a little reluctant to grade different bits of an online course separately from the overall learning outcome, because students have different ways of getting to those outcomes. I don't know if that helps, but...
Yeah, it kind of helps. I find that students often don't do things if there's no grades assigned to them. And so then you create an environment in which they learn, and I guess that's...
Do you give the assignments at the beginning of the course?
Yeah.
The exam questions, do you give them at the beginning?
I don't have exams. It's
okay. Because what I would do is I would either give them a previous year's assignment and say, okay, this discussion forum is related to you answering this assignment. Okay? Now, it may not be the same assignment in the exam, but it'll be about the same kind of topic and so on. So that's a motivation for them to do the work. There has to be a motivation for them to do it.
Yeah, that's very helpful.
But it doesn't have to be a grade necessarily. There's other ways to motivate students to participate.
Yeah, that's helpful.
The other one that I like, the UBC has done, they have the online class discussion, and then they have an open wiki. And this is a course in Latin American studies, and Repsol, Argentina just nationalized Repsol, the Spanish oil company, and they've been discussing the pros and cons of government monopolies and so on. And so the students said, look, we're talking amongst ourselves in British Columbia about this. I wonder what the Argentinians are thinking. So they did a wiki, and they put all their comments up on the wiki. And within 2 weeks, they had professors from Latin America attacking them vehemently about why it was a bad thing to, why it was a good thing to nationalize the oil company, and how the oil company screwed Argentina and all the rest of it. And they got a really good discussion going. Now that was in an open wiki, which anybody could share. But they could say things within the closed group that they couldn't say, that they wouldn't want to have said outside. So they got the best of both worlds that way. And then the students started, each student, now this is something that I strongly recommend. UBC has what's called UBC blogs and wikis, where any faculty member and any student can have their own blog, a UBC blog, managed by UBC. You know, the software is managed by UBC. They don't have to do anything except create content for that blog. And so students now, a lot of students have their course blogs, and they share the course blogs with other students. And it's something that the professor doesn't have to monitor or anything. The students are just doing it.
Is it internal to UBC, or people from outside can see it?
They're open, yeah. They're open. Students write a blog on any topic they like. It doesn't have to be a course, but they often discuss the course they're in. But they know it's open. Now the other thing that UBC has is called Digital Tattoo. It's a course the library runs for students about their online activities and behavior and how they're tracked and what footprint they leave. And so students have, yes, they have blogs, but they have education on the consequences of having a blog. And it's a responsible way for students to voice their own opinions. And of course, UBC does not take responsibility for whatever students say in their blogs. It's their students' blog. So, and of course, one of the things is to teach them good online behavior. It's a sort of halfway house between being within the class and being told what to do, and being free, going out into the outside world without any supervision whatsoever. Faculty can see those blogs, and if they don't like it, they can talk to the students about it. They say, look, this is not the right time for a blog, you know. So they have that interaction, but the students are still free. If they want to keep that blog, despite what the prof says, that's their choice. As far as I know. Now UBC may have changed its policy since I left, but that was the policy. But again, for faculty to have their own blogs and wikis, that opened up a lot of really interesting innovation in teaching.
Thank you for a lot of stimulating ideas. I want to go back to Nick's question about the synchronous versus the asynchronous mode, and especially in the MBA and executive MBA, the part-time MBA, students not only learn from their instructor, but they also learn from each other, and they are there for getting that experience. And a good instructor will play the role of facilitator, as you mentioned, to facilitate this very rich discussion to take place in class by just teasing it out. And so we do this well in our classes face-to-face. The question is, if we go to an asynchronous mode and somebody says something, and then 3 hours later a person responds, it kills the discussion. You know, it's often the case when I say something in class, a student picks up, another student says something, so we need to have that kind of thing, because when you have this more flexible delivery of blended, you can only deliver, say, 1/3 of the content in face-to-face. The 2/3 of the content still needs to be delivered in that kind of atmosphere.
Okay, three things. First of all, synchronous means the student has to be there at the right time, unless you're going to record it. And if you're going to record it, then you don't get the discussion, okay? So that's a restriction on access for many students. They often can't make a set time.
What if we force it, Tony? What if we force it? You have to be online Monday night at 9 p.m. Eastern.
Well, you get a high dropout rate.
Don't take the course.
Okay. No, that's fine.
I'm saying it as a joke, but I'm trying to be serious. How do we force the issue?
The second is, you can get just as good a quality of discussion online as face-to-face, but it's a different kind of discussion. Now, what I find is that with online forums, yes, there's a gap, but students are often more thoughtful because they've had time to think about a response before they type it in. Whereas in a face-to-face one, they come out with the first thing that comes into their head. So it's not necessarily, it depends on the quality of the face-to-face discussion and the quality of the online discussion. It's not a factor of the forum, or the way of delivery. Now again, you have to organize those discussion forums very carefully online, so students know what they're expected to do, and in fact you're managing that discussion just as heavily as you would probably more heavily than you would in a face-to-face session. The other thing is the students got a record of the discussion, so they can go back to it for revision purposes. They can see what the points were that we discussed. So there are pros and cons, and I would strongly argue that don't assume that one way of doing it is worse than the other. It's how you design each way that matters. Now, you may want to have both. You may want to have face-to-face and online discussion for different purposes. So for instance, for decision-making, you may well want a face-to-face course. If you want students to make decisions in a limited time period, then do that synchronously. Now, there's a program by the Justice Institute of BC, which is really good. It's for first responders, for police, fire, ambulance, and so on. And they have to respond to a disaster in real time, synchronously, because they're all over the place. They're in their jobs. And this is done synchronously, and then it's recorded, and then they go in afterwards to the Justice Institute for a debriefing about the things they could have done better. And that's done face-to-face, because it's often challenging an individual's decision under pressure, and it needs to be done in a face-to-face situation because it can be not threatening, but upsetting for somebody. So again, it's the context that matters, not the mode of delivery. Please. Okay, yes, please.
No, it's okay, you can go first.
Just on this topic, it's right on this topic. Like, I think you could look at a continuum of synchronous to asynchronous. Like, and if asynchronous means once a week, that's on one end of an asynchronous, but if synchronous is within a 5-hour window or 8-hour window, you know, that's a very different type of synchronous.
Yeah.
That I think that's got to be part of this discussion, because you know, if it's lagged by a long, long time, then that's very different than within a specified window. I don't know. Does that factor in?
Yeah. I mean, the big problem I've always had with online discussions is not the quality of the discussion, but making sure everybody participates. Because it's easy, but it's easy to hide in a classroom as well. You know, you can hide at the back of a classroom, or you can hide in the middle of a classroom and not really contribute anything to a discussion. And again, as I said, I don't care about that so long as the students gets to the learning outcome. But if they're not getting good grades, then I want to know why they're not participating. And the other thing, it's a very good warning sign. If a student is not participating in the discussion forums, they're having a problem usually. So I like to know. So I will then send an email to that student saying, I noticed you're not participating. I noticed you didn't do your last assignment. Can I help? 90% of the time I can't, because the boyfriend's broken up with them or something like that. But at least I know. And often I don't know in face-to-face class. So you know, there are pluses and minuses about both methods. Yes, please.
Yes, just a little thought is, I am not a fan of synchronous at all. I think the flexibility, the opportunity for students to do it in their prime time when they're really thinking and they're relaxed and it's the right time. But the solutions lie in setting up groups, I think part of the solution anyway. And the group can decide if they want to be synchronous at a certain point in time. But to try to make an entire class synchronous, you're going to run into all the same problems that you have right now with people not coming to physical class anyway. And making them, I know you were joking, but making them is completely the opposite to the whole philosophy of what we're doing here. So I think with discussion groups, you have to think about what's the purpose, why do you want the discussion. If it's to bring out the finer points, right, and to have ideas bouncing around, that's a face-to-face thing. But technology is never going to be able to do that as well as what you can do when you have that vibe and you have, you know, the hormones, you have everything floating around the classroom. The other stuff online, though, where you want a more thoughtful approach and you want more people to be in, because in class it is the same people. Now, MBA different, right, than undergraduate, but typically it's always the same people. So you'll get more contribution from more people online if you set up the expectations of what it is, if you use a certain methodology, a certain place. So I had online discussions in LinkedIn for my 4th year course this year. You get a very different type of thing if you were very clear about what the expectations are. And is it discussion for content purposes, or is it discussion for digital literacy skill development? And I'm more interested in you developing the skill of discussing things with people online in a professional way.
The other thing I would say is that many video conferences are not discussions. They're 70% content presentation and 30% discussion. So again, if you're running it as a discussion, it's very different than if you're doing it as a way of delivering content and then asking students to comment. So again, you have to think about what is the purpose here. The other, I'll say one last thing on that. There is a professor of business studies at Laval University, and he gives regular standard lectures. He has 200 students, and he starts in September with about 180 in the class, and by the time he got to March, he was down to about 50. And a lot of those students, the 150 dropped out. Not all of them, but some, you know, quite a lot. So what he did was he just put a webcam in front of his lectures and said to the students, you can come to the lectures or you can watch them at home. And it was minus 20 and snowing. Most of the students didn't come in, but they watched the lectures. And at the end of the course, he had 120 students rather than the 50 or so completing the course. Simply because of the transport difficulties and snow getting into and out of the lecture theatres and so on. So, yes, I mean, he didn't change his teaching at all. He just made it more easily accessible for the students. But he didn't get much discussion, but he didn't have much discussion anyway in his classroom. So it depends what you want to get. Yeah.
We're nearing the end of our time today, but I want to thank Tony for a wonderful talk. It's so motivating and encouraging to see someone passionate about online learning. Before we applaud him, I just want to
I'm passionate about face-to-face teaching.
Okay. Correct. 2 points. This lecture has been recorded, and we have Tony's slides, so thanks to McPherson. So we'll put them on some online platform and make them available. Additionally, we have a few slots open for one-on-one meetings today after 4:05 with Tony. So if you want 15 minutes or so, send me an email, I'm Brian Jetler, and I'll schedule in. But thank you, Tony, for a wonderful lecture.